Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Gretchen Rowe, and it is my very great pleasure to welcome these two gentlemen here who are children of pioneering homeschoolers. Ethan Demi and Will Estrada are going to join me today. They're going to tell you their story about being homeschooled and now advocating for the next generation. And we're going to talk about parental rights today. I'm very excited to have them join me. And since Ethan joined me first, Ethan, I'll let you introduce yourself first.
Thanks, Gretchen. Yeah, so if you have used any of the Demi Learning products, specifically the math products, there's a guy on those videos and he's bald, and that's my dad. So if you've seen those, for all the filming, I was in the audience or running the camera, or in the audience and not paying attention. And sometimes my dad had to tell us that, hey, we're on camera, pay attention. So if you've seen Matthew C, you've seen my dad. We're very similar. I like to say the tree doesn't grow very far from the apple. So a little bit of my backstory. Born in 1982, Will just mentions we're about a year apart. Both grew up in the early pioneering homeschool movement. I was born and raised in Georgia for the first couple years. Where homeschooling was just starting to become legalized in 1984. So back in the old days. And then we moved to Massachusetts, where my dad had been a private and public school teacher in Georgia and a pastor all at the same time. And then he became a private school teacher in Massachusetts. And then what we did was he started to teach some of these unschooler kids out in Massachusetts how to do math. And he would meet with them once a week. He would explain with these blocks how to do math, and then he would handwrite worksheets for those students. And after the first year, one of the moms came up and said, hey, can we buy your book? He said, sure. He didn't have a book, so we lived in a trailer, a double wide trailer, had 4 boys in bunk beds, and we took the stack of handwritten pages next door to there was a package store, a liquor store next door that we could walk to. We paid 3 cents a copy, and then took them back home, set up picnic tables, hand collated those, and that was the first Matthew C book. So that was sort of the genesis of what now is Demi Learning. But I've been homeschooled then all the way through. We moved to Pennsylvania in the 90s, was homeschooled all the way through high school, went to college, graduated, came back to the family business, took over marketing, and then fast forward, started running more of the company, and in 2011 became the CEO. So that's the quick backstory, but homeschool graduate all the way through, and stuck around. My dad has to talk to family that stays together. We're still sticking together. We all work at Demi Learning, both my parents and all my brothers, and we're now having a blast doing more stuff.
Ethan, I didn't realize we had something else in common in our backgrounds. I used to go to make copies at the liquor store until my pastor's wife called one day, and one of my kids said, well, she's at the liquor store. And was like, you can't say that. Yeah, it's amazing, but it's come a long way, and I'm so glad that your parents were pioneers, because in 1995 we got the chance to begin our homeschooling journey. And if it wasn't for you guys and your families, it wouldn't have been so easy for my family. So Will, tell us about you.
Well, Gretchen, there's a lot of similarities in my upbringing and listening to Ethan and knowing you, Ethan, over the years and the conversations that we've had. My dad is a public educator, and my mom gave up her career at IBM. She was working on the precursor of the internet in the late 70s, early 80s to homeschool. So we started homeschooling in upstate New York in 1988. I think just a year or two after homeschooling had become legal in the state of New York. And all the family was exceedingly hostile. The grandparents said, "You're going to ruin our grandchildren." And so the family dynamics were so hostile to my parents' decision to homeschool myself and my 7 siblings that when I was 10, we moved to northern Pennsylvania. And like Ethan, we lived in a double wide. There were 8 of us kids. Mom stayed home and homeschooled us. Dad was a public school teacher. So we thought everyone shopped at Goodwill and Salvation Army. And it wasn't until I moved to Northern Virginia and saw the McMansions and everything that I said, whoa, okay, maybe we were kind of poor growing up. But we had a great education, very, very engaged. We would discuss current events. We were involved in high school debate, which gave me a love of arguing and talking in public, I guess. And so after graduation, I actually did a unique higher ed. I skipped undergrad. I went straight to law school. And then soon after that, while still in law school, I got hired by the Homeschool Legal Defense Association. I first started off as a paralegal, then got hired as an attorney when I finished law school. And today I'm the president of the Parental Rights Foundation, a nationwide organization that's been around for 16 years working on parental rights issues.
Well, I'm delighted to have both of you join me today, and I think it's going to be a fascinating conversation. I am delighted to have the opportunity to facilitate this. Let me translate that for those of you who are joining us live. I'm going to let Ethan and Will talk, and I'm going to pay attention to the Q&A. We have these events on a weekly basis because we want to bring information that you are looking to hear. So if they say something today that brooks a question in your mind, please don't hesitate to ask through the Q&A so that we can make sure all the questions of our live attendees get answered today. And gentlemen, how about let's get started here. Ethan, tell me about your experience in the early days of homeschooling. You were homeschooled your whole life, so you don't have different paradigms, but we were laughing before we began about not telling anybody you were homeschooled. So what was that like?
Yeah, it was a different era back in the sort of mid to late 80s, early 90s. And that's when sort of homeschooling was just becoming legal, although some of those battles were being fought. I remember in Georgia, and I wasn't even old enough to be in school at that point. My older brother was starting to be homeschooled in Georgia. But my dad was involved in sort of I think it was GHEA, the Georgia Home Educators Association, when they first founded in the sort of, I think it was 1986. And this was in the days before email and podcasts and blogs. And so we knew that at the dinner table, if the phone rang, to not answer it during dinner time, because my dad would record a legislative update on the home answering machine. And so people would call in, it would go to voicemail, and the tape would play, and you would hear my dad's voice saying, all right, here's the bills, there's Senate bill number this, it's call your legislator and vote no or vote yes, call the governor's office. So they called themselves the Minutemen, so they could organize and mobilize quickly. So we knew that dinner time, you didn't answer the phone because the legislative update was getting shared, and you had phone trees, like, all right, so you call this person, they call the next person, they call the next person. You would spread the news through phone calls to the network to try to get things going. I remember when my dad first, he told the story of one of his first homeschool conferences he went to. I think Greg Harris was there. So it was Raymond and Dorothy Moore were moving through big names in the early homeschool movement, and Greg Harris was there as well. And he says, I met a gentleman in the restroom, and people wouldn't give you their last name. So they were afraid that someone was there trying to find out who was this clandestine group of homeschoolers. So it was no last names. You were there to learn. There's a lot more parent training. And the other interesting thing, and this is sort of how Matthew C. was started in the first place, is you couldn't buy textbooks. So none of the major publishers would sell textbooks to parents, especially teacher manuals. And the private Christian school publishers wouldn't sell either, because the Christian school movement didn't like homeschooling because it took market share from them. So your early days, you couldn't buy a teacher manual to a math book. in most places. And so this is before Amazon, before the internet. So a lot of the early homeschool curriculum was founded because you didn't have anything, you had to write it yourself. And so that was how it started. But yeah, I was raised, we moved to Pennsylvania, Massachusetts, and then Pennsylvania. And yeah, we would learn, the rule was once the school bus drives by the house, then you're allowed to play in the front yard. Before that, you can play in the backyard, because we'd do our school, if we were studious, we'd get up, do our schoolwork, and we're done by noon, unless we lallygagged, and then we're still doing schoolwork at dinner time. But we'd have plenty of time to play. And then once the school bus came, now we could move to the front yard, and we memorized, if we go shopping, here's what you say if someone asks, why aren't you in school? Nowadays, homeschooling is just another alternative education option that parents can choose, and everyone knows 2 or 3 people, they're one degree of separation from multiple homeschoolers. So you still have stereotypes and people who don't like it or like it, but it's more of, it's a normal thing. I may not like it, but it's normal, or I love it, but it's normal. It's more like, hey, yeah, anyone can do it, which is great. But I feel like the modern homeschooler doesn't really appreciate, it was a different world in the 90s for homeschooling.
So Will, tell us a little bit about your dad having the vision to homeschool you guys when he's a public educator. What brought that about?
Yeah, so it was both of my parents, and it was that they really wanted there to be a Christian education for us as kids. They saw firsthand that the public schools were incredibly secular. And this is even back in the 80s and early 90s. I talked to parents who say, you know, when did the public schools become secular? And I'm like, well, they've been kind of secular for a while. And that was the primary motivation that my parents had with that. So it was a natural fit for them to try homeschooling. And I think they were incredibly committed to it because of the religious values. And it's interesting because my wife and I are homeschooling our 2 kids. They're 10 and 5. And we homeschool more because it's what we believe is best for our kids right now, but less so because of our religious beliefs, even though we're strong Christians. And so I think that's even something that's changed somewhat with today's generation of homeschoolers as well, at least for some of them.
Some of us became homeschoolers because we felt the education system was failing our kids.
Exactly. And that's a large number of people today.
It is really true that it's lovely that we have the opportunity to make those choices, but then we need to stand by those choices again. So let's talk a little bit about choice and parental rights in the guise of, what are you seeing, Will? What does it look like? What does the landscape look like today?
Gretchen, as I said at the beginning, we have seen huge victories in parental rights when it comes to education. A lot of people forget, but the very first Supreme Court case dealing with parental rights was 1923. It was Meyer versus Nebraska. And Nebraska had passed a law saying children could not be taught in any language other than English. And of course, a lot of these laws at the time were xenophobic. There was hostility towards the poor Eastern European immigrants who spoke German, or Jewish immigrants. And so it was a lot of hostility towards them. And actually, Meyer versus Nebraska was about a small Lutheran school and the teacher, Robert Meyer, teaching a 10-year-old boy, a German immigrant, how to read from the German Bible. And the U.S. Supreme Court overturned his conviction, got rid of this law from Nevada, and said that parental rights, it was the first case where they said parents have the right to choose how their education are taught, and establishing that parental rights are fundamental. 2 years after that, the more famous case, Pierce versus Society of Sisters, where the U.S. Supreme Court unanimously said the child is not the mere creature of the state, that the parents are the ones who have the right. That case came out of Oregon when the KKK had actually lobbied and successfully passed a law banning private education. So those 100 years ago, the future of just parents to be able to choose how their children were educated, or even private education, was in doubt. And thankfully, those cases that today have become the foundation of parental rights jurisprudence in the country, they established that you can have private schools, that parents are the ones who can choose how to educate their children. When HSLDA was founded in 1983, and when lawyers were arguing that parents in our country should be able to have the right to educate their children at home, they've relied on these cases. So when we're talking about parental rights, we have to first think of where we've been and look at the incredible strides that have been made. And I talk to a lot of parents who are very frustrated about what's going on in their public schools. And in some ways they think, oh, parental rights are under siege. But another way of looking at it is the last bastion where we're fighting for parents to be able to be engaged is in the public schools. And I think it's important to note that many public schools, the parents have very good relationships with their teachers and with the schools. It's a lot of the outliers that we see right now.
Well, if it's mainstream, it doesn't necessarily make the news, but if it's avant-garde and really, one wing or the other, then it becomes newsworthy. Otherwise, those of us who had the opportunity and the privilege of educating our kids at home aren't newsmakers. We're just world changers, and that's the difference.
I like that.
Is it just a homeschool issue? Is parental rights just a homeschool issue? And I'm going to leave that in both your for a question for both of you, because Ethan is also a public alderman. So do you see this in your public sphere as well, Ethan?
Yeah, to me, parental rights is a fundamental right that is sort of necessary for homeschooling to exist, but also is much broader than homeschooling. And that's part of why I got involved in the Parental Rights Foundation initially. So I've been on their board since 2018, was when I joined their board and was chair for a while. And to me, it is more than just homeschooling, but it also is the fundamental right that gives you that right to homeschool. So it's one of, if you take it away, homeschooling is merely a legislative option that can be removed. But if it's an enshrined right, then that sort of is, that's the default piece of all parents have rights regardless of what education they choose for their kids. And then if they choose a public education, those are also the rights to say, all right, I should be informed of what my kid's learning in the classroom. I have the right to know what's going on. But also it goes into the medical sphere of what treatment should my child get? But also, I mean, it's the full gamut. We've been involved in cases sort of across the board. Because, I mean, the other big difference, and this goes back to sort of the shift in home education over the years, when I talk to a lot of homeschool parents today, and it's a similar view that my parents had when they homeschooled. So they chose to homeschool us because they thought they could do a better job passing on their faith to their kids by homeschooling, but they also always took it a year at a time. So they always said, we are choosing to homeschool for this year, and then they would remake that decision every year. So each year they would reevaluate and say, is this the best thing this year for my kids? And I see that happening much more frequently. So the barrier, I call it the barrier of entry into homeschooling, is a lot lower. Also, the barrier of exit is a lot lower. So we now have public schools, private schools. We've got homeschool co-ops that meet 5 days a week for 6 hours a day. We've got hybrid schools where you're in a private school, but you're meeting 2 days a week. We've got charter schools, cyber charter schools, education savings accounts. So most parents I meet today that are homeschooling, they might have one child in a charter school and one child being homeschooled and one child in the local public school. And then the next year it all shifts because, all right, now you joined the traveling lacrosse team and we pulled you out and enrolled you in the cyber charter so you could travel and play lacrosse because you're on a scholarship path to college. Or, hey, you're really into horse riding and equestrian stuff. We're going to take 2 years off and homeschool you and let you focus on being a really great horseback rider. And the flexibility lets a lot more parents in. And so I see switching happening a lot more frequently. And it's not a bad thing because parents are exercising their rights to say, you know what, for this year, for this season, for this child, this is the best fit. And at the end of the day, I trust the parent to make that decision. I don't think the government or Will or myself should tell parents, no, you always have to do this or you always have to do this. And those are our customers.
You should say that, Ethan. That is really the undergirding of our homeschool experience. My husband and I said we will do for each child what is best for them for this coming year. And when my fifth kid, Duncan, decided he didn't want to be homeschooled anymore, I needed a 12-step program to walk away from the homeschool journey. But you know what? It was the right decision for him. And our last one will graduate from public school in 12 weeks. And it's been a great experience for both of those kids. And I'm glad that we had the latitude to make the decisions that was best for them.
Yeah,
But I want to, now you've said some things and I want to ask a question, because when you got involved with the parental rights organization, you were not yet a parent. So why?
I wasn't an official parent.
This is true. This is true.
I've had and you could listen to the podcast I did with Will where we talked a little bit more about that. So I've been a foster parent, and before that, we helped raise multiple of siblings.
Correct. This is true.
So I call it the OPKs. I've had over a dozen other people's kids in my house over the years, and so I think it gives you gave me a rounded view of parental rights. It's a messy issue, no matter how you slice it. When you get into the weeds and the specifics, it's going to evoke a lot of emotions from folks when they dig into it. But if you let's start with parental rights are fundamental. If that's our starting point, it gives us a common ground to be able to then argue about multiple policy issues, whether they're state, local, at your school district. And sometimes you start talking and you realize that the other person doesn't believe in that fundamental right. I mean, I've met homeschoolers that don't believe that homeschooling is a fundamental right. They think it should be a right for only certain people who meet certain requirements. A lot of times people use the language of parental rights or even homeschooling and to really say, I just want to get in charge so I can tell you what to do with your kids. And so I view it as this gives us a common language and grounding to be able to have those policy debates, which we need to have. But it is a lot broader. I mean, you use the word alderman. So I'm a township supervisor in East Lampeter Township. So I've been elected official for over a decade. So, but when you're talking with your police officers, your firefighters, when you're looking at zoning reform, I mean, it's simple things like zoning. You can either have a pro-parent view of zoning or an anti-parent view. If you want to raise chickens and you say, hey, I think my kids should have a garden in the front yard. Oh, you're not allowed to have a garden in your front yard in that suburban neighborhood. Or I'd like to have chickens and reduce my grocery budget and also teach my kids about raising chickens. Oh, you're not allowed to in a residential 1 zoning district. I'd like to start a small business and teach my kids a little bit about the economy. Oh, you can't in that zoning district. So there's a lot of things that when you really start peeling back the layers, parental rights start to be that foundational piece that once you identify it, you can start to say, no, you should be able to have chickens. Maybe not roosters if it's a high density neighborhood, but chickens are fine. Keep the smell down. Start a business with your kids. I mean, Matthew C was started in our basement and we would unload 18-wheelers off of the street by hand because we didn't have a forklift or a warehouse. Luckily, we lived in an area that had pretty open zoning, but we couldn't, where our business is located now, we have 50 employees across the country in a large warehouse. You couldn't start the business that we run now in our home in that area. So to me, the freedom goes beyond and it's much deeper. So those are the things that I start to look at every day. And when you look at it through the lens of parents and families and being pro-parent and pro-family, all of a sudden you start to go, you know what, we should change our zoning laws. We should look at the way we do education. We should give more choices to parents and let them do things with their kids that maybe I wouldn't want to do, but yeah, let them do it. Let's empower parents to make those decisions.
Chickens are on my mind right now because we have 5 acres. We live in a homeowners association, and my wife just got 8 chicks. And so if anyone from our HOA is listening, they are pets. They are not livestock.
Or you could use quail, because quail usually isn't in the ordinance. They say chicken.
Well, as somebody who has 67 chickens, I will tell you that they aren't always quiet, but they sure are a lot of fun. We run up against this issue all the time. My husband's a master beekeeper and helps other beekeepers here in Western North Carolina. And you'd be surprised at how often an HOA freaks out when somebody says, I'm going to keep bees. So, and chickens are a lot more innocuous, I think, than bees. But Will, your background is so varied and so wide. What made you decide that this was where you wanted to hang your hat? Which came first, and no pun here intended, was the chicken of parental rights ahead of all the things you've done, including sitting on the Supreme Court bar, or what brought you to this position now?
Oh, that's a great question, Gretchen. I always really knew I wanted to be a lawyer. I mean, of course, went through the typical stages of wanting to be a firefighter or a jet fighter pilot. But by age 11, I knew I wanted to be a lawyer. And I had always admired the work that Homeschool Legal Defense did. And so it was a dream come true when I got hired to be a paralegal at Homeschool Legal Defense. I was still in law school at the time. I was actually doing a correspondence law school. So I was doing law school at night, remotely, and then working a full 40-hour work week during the week. And I loved my time at Homeschool Legal Defense. I rose through the ranks. I was one of the attorneys. I did all the federal lobbying. So I worked on federal legislation, multiple bills that we worked on to protect parental rights and homeschooling were passed and were signed by bipartisan presidents. We had George W. Bush sign some of our legislation. We had Barack Obama sign some of our legislation, because homeschooling really has become bipartisan. And I thought I would retire from Homeschool Legal Defense. Then in 2018, kind of had a drastic career shift. I, on a whim, applied to work at the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services in the Office for Civil Rights, so enforcing civil rights law in the context of health and human services, doctors, medical offices, and got hired as a career employee with the federal government. And it's a very different area of law, but it was still civil rights, religious freedom, racial protections, protecting, the downtrodden, basically. And I loved my time in the federal government, served through 2 administrations. And then, though, kind of something changed, and I realized the federal government is a great employer, but it's very, very slow, and things move at a glacial pace. And I realized I am a little bit more of an ADD lawyer than I thought I was, and so I gave up my cushy government job. And right after Glenn Youngkin got elected, I got hired by the board. So Ethan was one of the people involved in that. So thank you, Ethan. He was, I think, chairman of the board at the time, and got hired to become the first full-time president of the Parental Rights Foundation. And so here I am. I'll be 40 later on this year, and I feel like I've found my life's calling to be working on behalf of not just homeschool parents, as Ethan said, that homeschooling is a subset of parental rights, but on behalf of all parents, whether it's parents who are unjustly accused of child neglect because they let their child walk home from the bus stop, or whether it's homeschool parents, or whether it's trying to reform our foster care and adoption, child welfare agencies to protect children by empowering parents. We have Strict can have a fire hose sometimes, but it's a lot of work and it's very rewarding.
I can imagine that your advocacy would have probably helped us in our homeschooling years when the neighbor called me and said, do you realize your boys are on the roof of your house? And I was like, yeah, they're up there running a science experiment. In this day and age, I'd probably be arrested for that. But
free-range parenting, following up with the chicken
right,
metaphor.
That's right. And the science experiment went well, by the way. So what do you gentlemen see as what parents can do in a position of advocacy to help others exercise those rights? What's missing here? What are we missing as members of communities that we should be thinking about? And I guess one of the things I'm thinking about is some of the changes that are happening in schools right now with regard to what kids can read and things like that.
I think Well, it's a great question of how can you support parents in advocacy? And I think there's a several prong level here. First is it starts with the family. And so love your kids, love your community. It's sort of like that scriptural provision of love the Lord your God, and then love your neighbor as yourself. And that
Right.
really is the start. It's we as parents can be impatient with our kids sometimes and not love them the way that we should. And whether you're homeschooling your children, private schooling, public schooling, whether your kids are not yet school age, really that's kind of the first step of love your kids, put that time into them. And that's why so many parents are so engaged in their children's education, because of that love that they have for their children. So take the time to smell the roses. And sometimes that's hard when your kids are younger and you're just kind of living in the second and don't even have time, if you're a mom, to wash your hair or have a moment to yourself. But really try and find that time. But then that second aspect of loving those around you. If you're an older parent, particularly if you're an older homeschool parent, find those struggling homeschoolers or just, parents of young kids and come alongside of them. Give them a date night if you can. Help out maybe in a co-op sort of thing, because the family is the building block of society. And we need, though, to support the families, whether even there might be people listening who don't have kids or their kids have graduated. Look at how you can pass on that freedom, because it really does all start with the family. And then as part of that, be engaged in your community. I talk to a lot of angry public school parents right now, and I always remind them, you can draw more flies with honey than you can with vinegar. And before you go in guns blazing, I'm going to file a Section 1983 federal civil rights lawsuit and going to destroy this blankety blank school board. I'm like, whoa, take a breath here. Sometimes you can draw more flies with honey than you can with vinegar. I think of the Jewish and Christian scriptures and Psalms of a soft answer turns away wrath. And oftentimes that's a good start. Now, sometimes you do need to file that federal Section 1983 lawsuit, but start off with that thoughtful, measured, trying to build relationships and then see where that goes.
Right. That makes a tremendous amount of sense. And I think that you provide wise counsel in a measured response as well, is being able to figure that out. Ethan, how do you see that in your community now, in all the things that you do?
Yeah, it's for two things I always start with. One is sort of piggyback off of Will said, is the best thing parents can recognize is that they are the parent, and that it's an incredible power that comes with that, and an expertise that is unduplicatable. I use, when I talk at different conferences, I'll use the story of the 10,000 hours of dedicated practice makes you an expert. Malcolm Gladwell quotes that a lot. And if you just take the average American parent, the amount of time the average parent spends with their kids, by the time the kid is 6 years old, the average American parent, moms and dads, have spent 16,000 hours with that child. If you enrolled that kid in school at 6, by the time they're 18 and they were in a one-room schoolhouse every day with the same teacher for their entire, like, the teacher will not have that much time with that student for their entire education experience if it was one teacher teaching every class all the way until graduation. So the expertise that a parent has is you can't duplicate it. Now, it doesn't make you an expert on anyone else's kid. It's only your kid. So there's a reason that teachers, to manage a classroom of 30 kids, it requires multiple years of training and education to say, all right, now I'm going to be an expert at managing a bunch of kids. But they're never going to be, no government official, no teacher is ever going to be able to know what you know about your kids. And that knowledge is power, and we have to respect that. But you can walk into any meeting with your doctor, your teacher, anybody, and go, I am the expert on my kid. And there's no way that anyone can duplicate that. So that's sort of what I start with, is recognize the power that you have, and then you do have rights. So educate yourself on what your rights are, and don't give them up. But to piggyback on also what Will said about, you can get more flies with honey. We've had some contentious school board elections and meetings in my town over the last couple years. And I often go, you've got the folks who clearly want to be engaged in their kids' education, going to meetings and screaming at people. And I go, would you take your child with you to the school board meeting and act like that? Oftentimes we tell kids, you're playing on a playground with your friends. It's like, don't yell at each other. Stop, listen to the other person talk. Don't hit, don't throw things, don't stomp off angrily, try to resolve it. All the things we teach kids, none of those things are happening in most school board meetings I've gone to. So the first thing is there needs to be a civility of parents need to lead by example to their kids of here's how we want you to resolve conflicts. If you don't like what your school's doing, absolutely show up to the school board meeting, get 10 of your friends and show up, but have a plan, be engaged, know your rights, and work constructively. I remember early when I was getting involved in the Parental Rights Foundation, actually before I was actually on the board, I got an HSLDA alert about a bill that was coming through Pennsylvania. So the story goes, there was a bill that was going to increase mandatory reporting and shift that responsibility to school districts to be where everyone reports to. And there was this e-alert that went out, and it was like, call and tell your state representative to vote no. So I went a step further, and I called up the chair of the education committee, and I scheduled a meeting. Put on my suit, drove up to Harrisburg, walked in, met with him and his staff, and they knew a little bit of who I was and what my background was. And you walked in, it was a very defensive posture. Everyone's wondering what's going on. We're here to argue. And I just started with, here's the bill. Who wrote it and why did they write it? They're obviously trying to solve a problem. What problem are they trying to solve? So all of a sudden the defenses come down, they explain it. I go, all right. And there was a problem. You had parents in Philadelphia who were about to get their kids taken away, who were abusing their children, who would quickly pull them out of school and declare themselves homeschooling as a way to avoid oversight. And I said, that's a problem. We should stop that. Is this the best way to solve the problem? So once we agreed on the problem, then it was what's the best way to solve it? And I said, do we have any other mechanisms for mandatory reporting whereby this would, like, if we didn't have this bill, how would someone report abuse and neglect? Oh, well, who would their neighbor call? Who would the doctor call? All right, we have those mechanisms. What if you have a parent raising someone who's got special needs and they're an adult? Should they report abuse to the school district? And you start to walk through some other things. And by the end of the conversation, we're able to find, and the bill was just pulled at that point. So it was just and I don't know if I did anything with that or other people also were lobbying on it, but it was just a simple one of walking someone through, your bill is trying to solve a real problem, but there's unintended consequences of that are going to have real world problems for other people. And we already have mechanisms in place. Can we work with those existing structures and not create an entire new reporting mechanism to do that? But I remember the look on the face of the staff when I just started with a question, as opposed to coming in and saying, this bill is horrible. And it was a horrible bill. There's no denying that. But when you lead with, what problem are you trying to solve? Let's work together to find a solution that doesn't trample on parental rights. Now we can find a common ground. So, and then there's times when you also need to organize a rally and a protest. And I've spoken at parental rights rallies in Harrisburg too, where we mobilize families to come in and we have speeches and we go lobby. So there's a time and a place for each one of those things. So I always remind people, parents, you have rights, you have the power, you're the expert on your kids. Right. Now take that and engage with your elected officials, but don't be afraid to just schedule a meeting. That's my number one thing I've learned in politics is people are very accessible. If you just call up and say, I'd like to talk to you about this one thing, and you start going in asking questions as opposed to yelling at them, you can get a lot done.
I remember several years ago now, I'm not going to date myself here, but a young teenage man said to one of my colleagues this past weekend at a conference back in the 1900s, So going in to have a similar conversation with Bob Ehrlich in Maryland about a law that was being passed or being put forth, I should say. And it was a very enlightening conversation. And I think, Ethan, you've taught us a very valuable tool here is to ask questions instead of coming in guns blazing, like you have made the assumption that you understand everything. Will, I'd like to ask you a question there. Have you worked on a recent case for which you're most proud? Give us a little bit of insight into how parental rights and the Parental Rights Foundation helps families keep those rights.
The case I'm most proud of is one that actually Ethan was involved in. It predated me, although I was here for the victory aspect of it. In 2020, DC City Council passed what they called the Minor Consent to Vaccination Act. This was a law allowing children as young as 11 to consent to vaccinations without parental involvement or even knowledge. And DC Council said, we want to make this so child-focused that the parents aren't even going to know after the fact if their children receive this vaccination. Now, we're not against vaccines. We're not for vaccines. We simply think that families should talk with their pediatrician and make what's the best decision, guided by their pediatrician and them for their own children. But we were deeply concerned about parents being cut out of the equation in the District of Columbia. We tried to fight this in the DC Council. I think only one member of the DC Council voted against this bill and it became law. And then there were two parents, both minority parents, and we represented a dad named Victor Booth, who a Black Christian, who said, I don't want my children to have to get these vaccines without me being involved in making the decisions. And his then 11-year-old son wrote this picture, and it was so impactful to the judge that the judge actually included this drawing from the 11-year-old in his decision. But the picture was of this sad little kid and everyone bullying him, being like, get the shot, get this one, get that. And him being like, what should I do? And this is the little stick figure drawing that the kid drew. So the Parental Rights Foundation and our now current chairman of the board, Jim Mason, filed suit in federal district court. And we were joined by Children's Health Defense, which also had some plaintiffs in this case as well. And in March of 2022, we won this case. The federal judge issued a preliminary injunction against it. He said that this violated the family integrity, but more to the point that it violated federal law, saying that when kids get a vaccine, they need to get information from the doctor about the impact of the vaccines. So DC settled. They didn't even try and appeal the decision. And today, Victor Booth and these other parents, they are free from this mandate. So that's an example of the type of case that we get involved in. We do a lot of legislative work as well. For our listeners in Virginia, we hear Governor Youngkin talk constantly about Virginia's fundamental parental rights statute. He will always reference where it's codified at Virginia Code Annotated Section 1-240.1. And our organization worked on Virginia's fundamental parental rights statute back in 2013. It was a bipartisan bill. Mark Herring, the former Attorney General of Virginia, voted in favor of it when he was then in the Virginia Senate. And this law sat unused until Governor Youngkin and his administration came in and said, we're going to dust this law off. We're going to use it to protect parental rights. And so just today, actually, I submitted testimony on a fundamental parental rights bill in North Dakota to defend parental rights of parents in those states. 15 states have these laws. It's one of our top priorities, and we're working in about 15 other states right now to ensure that parental rights are codified at state level.
I remember when that DC law was passed. I was already living in North Carolina at the time, but I remember thinking, I think they had the wrong end of that stick. So I'm really glad to hear that you all were able to take that on and make a tremendous difference, because to me, as a parent of 6 children, some with special needs, not knowing what is happening with them, particularly from a healthcare perspective, would be a little bit alarming, because I think we should have the opportunity to be able to guide our children to make good choices. So, gentlemen, a question for you both. How do you all see parental rights and homeschooling changing over the next few years?
The biggest thing I think is homeschooling has become mainstream. Prior to the pandemic, I would hear parents all the time say, wow, the homeschooling sounds great for you, but I don't think I could ever do it. And because of the pandemic, every single parent, some for a shorter period of time, some for longer periods of time, they really all became homeschooling parents. And so many of them saw that it was not best for their children, or maybe best for them. And so now their kids are in private school or charter schools or back in the public schools that have reopened. But every single parent got that initiation into what homeschooling is like. And even for those who are like, oh, those are the worst, I could never do that again. They have, when I talk to these parents, they have a respect for homeschooling parents. And a constant refrain I'll hear is, wow, I did that for 2 weeks, 6 weeks, 2 months, a year before our public schools opened up. It was so hard. My hat is off to you. And so, at least in the United States, I think homeschooling now is mainstream. It's growing. It's not something that is really looked on as askance anymore as it used to. I saw that some of our listeners, I've asked questions about homeschooling in different countries, and I think there's less of that in different countries. I saw specifically someone asking in Italy, and homeschooling is legal in Italy. But I think even the impact of the pandemic in other countries has given more interest to homeschooling. And so I think, at least from my vantage point, that's one of the most interesting things to see, that homeschooling is mainstream.
Yeah, I would say the number of people who have now at least tried it is everyone. So there's personal knowledge of having done it, which is very healthy, even if it's, hey, I'm not going to homeschool my kids, but now I have a much greater respect for everyone who does. And so there's a general understanding. So I would agree that homeschooling is not going anywhere in the United States. You still need organizations like HSLDA and others to continue to defend that. But what I think you are going to see grow is more options and choices for parents. And you're seeing that across the country. You have a lot of states now trying different things as a result of the pandemic is a good example of, hey, a bunch of kids all switched to online learning, and some of them it did not work for, but some of them it did work for. And so now you have those pieces of, you now have parents going, hey, some of these pieces I liked and some of it I didn't like. So the other thing that I see that came out of the pandemic was, even when you were remote learning at home with your kids, the parents got a glimpse into the classroom and a direct look at the curriculum that their kids were getting, and the instruction that, and the amounts of sort of actual parent teacher interaction that their kids were getting. And I think a lot of parents went, oh, I think we can do better than this, or I don't like what I saw, or my kids just playing on their iPad most of the time, and they're not actually doing school. So I think the level of parental engagement in the schools, whether it's public or private. So parents know that they have options that they can do if they need to. And they're also now going and getting much more engaged in whatever school their kids are in. And they're saying, I want it to be better. And so we're having I talked to a consultant recently who consults with school boards. And he's like, all right, how do I coach these school board members on dealing with these new folks? I said, the school boards for the last 20 years have made it very hard for parents to engage with school boards. And you have to be really mad to actually get to the meeting on time and show up. If you make it easier for more parents to engage and actually listen to them, that'll solve your problem. But if you start creating these more adversarial school board meetings, it's not going to go well. So to me, it's one of the homeschooling, I think, is very secure. I think you're going to see some disruption happening across the board. I mean, I've seen private Christian schools all of a sudden change and go, oh, now we're adding a homeschool friendly component where here's a menu. You can take whatever courses you want at whatever time fits that we're offering it. And it's an a la carte system. And so I think the options are going to increase, and the level of parent engagement in the local schools, whether it's public or private, is also increasing. And there's going to be some disruption period, but I think overall the more parents that are engaged, the better. And it's only going to create better things for their kids, the more the parents care and show up to those meetings. So I'm encouraged. It's not one of the, so Will mentioned his favorite case. There's a bill that we've been working on and off over the last couple of years in Pennsylvania. It's a good example of when you really dig into it, parental rights is not a right wing or a left wing issue. And so each side has tried to put us in a box of, oh, well, you're with the left wing, you're with the right wing. It's like, yeah, we've each got our individual backgrounds we come from, but we were working to try to work on, we had two bills, one we were opposing in Pennsylvania and one we were supporting. So we had our parental rights amendment, Republican sponsor of that bill. And then there's another bill that we were trying to oppose. So on the one hand, we're working with the right-wing groups, and on the other hand, we're working with the ACLU of Pennsylvania to oppose a very bad bill from a parental rights standpoint. And I remember, I think that was one of the first times Will and I hung out. We were lobbying up in Harrisburg, and you'd talk to the same lawmaker and shake their hand, and they're like, "Oh yeah, I support the parental rights amendment." I was like, "Great, why did you vote for Senate Bill 17? What was it?
1731.
1737 in 2021." Yeah, so I was like, and they're like, "Oh, what bill is that?" I described it like, "Oh, I oppose that." I was like, "Well, you voted for it." I have to check with my staff. And that was a common refrain of, "Oh, we were just told by leadership to vote for that bill. We didn't read it." And this was, and a couple of them were homeschool graduates. These were homeschool graduates who had voted. They were supporting one bill and they supported both bills, and we were supporting one and opposing one. And it was really interesting because if you said we support parental rights, full stop, then it makes sense. But if it was, hey, I'm coming at this from a right-wing viewpoint, then you can support both, or a left-wing viewpoint, you can oppose both. But it was really one of, we support parents, and parents are different. Parents do things differently. So those are some of the ones I use as an example of it. It really is it's a singular issue, but it has broad application. But overall, I'm encouraged for what I see happening, at least in the United States. You have a lot more parents recognizing that, oh, I do have rights, and you can't just ignore them or take them away without me fighting back and making sure I retain those rights.
Well, you referenced our list of questions that parents ask us. I have them up over here, and you guys have really done a very good job of answering those questions. So I haven't really had to call any out, but there is one I would like to ask you, and that is resources for parents. What kind of things does the Parental Rights Foundation offer by way of resources for parents to know how to participate in an advocacy guise in their own communities?
So at parentalrights.org, we have a ton of resources. Right on our homepage, we basically have everything you need to be your own little lobbyist or talk with your friends about our parental rights amendment to the U.S. Constitution. We have information about state by state, your rights in those states. So encourage our listeners to go there. Some other good resources, you're talking to one of them right now, Ethan Demi with Demi Learning. They've really got it all for the education of your children. I love the work that Demi Learning does. So I would encourage our listeners to check out their resources as well. Then if you want to find out more about the legality of homeschooling in your state, Homeschool Legal Defense has some great information, and it's simply hslda.org. There's a ton of resources for parents out there to find out what they need.
Absolutely. HSLDA was integral in the 21 years that we homeschooled. We wouldn't have done it without them. And we appreciate the ground that they plowed before we trod it, so that we were able to do it easily. And it makes a terrific difference to families as they make their homeschool journeys. Gentlemen, we've got about 5 minutes left, and I'd like to ask each of you for closing comments. Will, how about you go first?
Gretchen, when we think about parental rights and just the importance that parents can have on their children, it really is the foundation of a child's life, with a sort of person they're going to be as they grow up. And so just always remember what Ethan said of those 10,000 hours. You know your child better than anyone. And that's why we defend parental rights, that it really is not an issue of should children be making these decisions or parents. Everyone knows that children need guidance. And so the question is, will it be their loving parents who provide that guidance, or will it be a government bureaucrat who provides that guidance? And at Parental Rights Foundation, we believe that it should be their loving parents. And then whether you choose to educate your children at homeschool, private school, virtual school, public school, a charter school, continue to be engaged in their education. Just because you have your children enrolled in a public school doesn't mean you don't do anything. You need to be involved in their children's education. Just because you're homeschooling your children doesn't mean everything is going to be daisies and buttercups. You still need to be there, not just as the teacher, but as their parent as well. And seek out people who can come alongside of you and support you in that journey.
Ethan?
Whether it's education or even talking about parental rights, you don't need to be an academic genius or a legal genius to start to make a difference. And especially with your kids, you don't have to be a homeschool parent. You don't need to have a degree in education to do that. The biggest thing that I got from my parents and I'm hoping to pass on to my kids is values. And so as long as you can identify those values, the value of learning, the value of being curious, the value of recognizing I don't know everything, but I can figure it out. Those are the values that are most important to pass on to the next generation, to say, hey, we don't have all the answers, but I can teach you to read and write and do math. And I can teach you to be curious and figure it out. And I can teach you how to engage with our legal system to make my community better. I can show up to school board meetings and demonstrate that one person can make a difference in their community. That's what the kids need, is they need parents to model that lifelong learning approach that says, I may not know everything now, but I sure can figure it out, and I'm willing to take chances and make mistakes along the way. And that's what I'm encouraged by. There's a homeschooling mom and author, Angela Schwintz, who said, "While we try to teach our children about life, our children teach us what life is all about." And it's really a journey. It never ends, and it's in a constant state of change, and you just have to enjoy the journey and figure it out one step at a time.
Absolutely. And I thank you both for taking the time out of your wickedly busy schedules to join me this afternoon for this conversation. I think it makes a tremendous amount of difference. I know in the 21 years that we home educated our children, we spent more than one day at the State House. When we were part of those phone trees that Ethan talked about early on, hey, they're about to do this, or did you know this was happening? And sometimes people today forget that the pioneers of home education had really to push against the system to give us the freedoms and liberties that we enjoy today. So, gentlemen, thank you both for joining me today. I'm very grateful for your time. I hope this has given parents food for thought. There's some little lawyer out there, Will, who's heard what you had to say today and is now going to aspire to become that kind of advocate for families. And Ethan, there's some little CEO sitting out there who doesn't know it yet, but in some guise and some form, he will figure out, based on what you have shared today, how to represent themselves well in the future. So thank you all so much for sowing into the future of future generations. And I appreciate you all very much.
Thanks, Gretchen.
Take care,
Gretchen,
gentlemen.
thank you for having us on. Appreciate it.
All righty. Bye-bye.